Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I'm in the wrong.
Parents, we did 4 years today. I've had real sweet experience.
First of all, she had a fall this morning, nothing broken, I think she just all bruised up.
I have no spot.
Mr. David Vander's family, I ask to pray for him. I ask everyone to pray for him.
Anything else? All right, let's go for a word of prayer. Father, thank you that we have the opportunity to be in your house today. And I pray that you would calm our hearts and help us not to be distracted by all the other things that are going on in our lives and in the world around us, and we would be able to spend some time focusing on you, appreciating you for who you are and how great you have been in our lives. We come before you this morning, some with heavy hearts and some with burdened hearts because of the requests that have been mentioned. A lot of folks that we know that are dealing with cancer and serious illnesses. Some of them have gotten some good reports, and some of them have gotten not so good reports. Some of them have very important decisions to make concerning treatments and what can be done, and for some, not sure even what can be done, and it burdens our hearts because the only thing we can do is come before you and ask that you would work on their behalf, that you would give doctors guidance and wisdom, that you would give patience, that you would give understanding, that you would give peace beyond all understanding that comes from your presence. And we ask that you would comfort family members who are struggling and having a tough time. Know that some of these folks have had some fairly long, drawn-out battles, and some of them have been pretty serious. It seems like every time you think Mr. Vanderwer's getting better, something else comes along, and you know they've been trying to clean out infection and deal with complications there. Hopefully, procedures that he's had recently would make a difference, and that his body would continue to be strong enough that you would touch him and that he would be able to recover. For Lynn's daughter, I know it's been a very difficult and emotional situation there, and I pray that you would help her to continue to recover and to have the strength that she needs day by day, moment by moment, especially in the discouraging times. Pam, as she's traveling today, give safety on the road. I know others are traveling as well. Serious doctor's appointments that are coming up, and you would give wisdom in the decisions that they have to make. Pray for unspoken requests, and sometimes they weigh hard upon our hearts, and it's difficult to know what to do. Sometimes the most difficult decisions are being torn between two things that are good. And I trust that you would give peace, and that you would give comfort, and that you would give good advice. And for Lance, as he's going to be traveling back from Pittsburgh, that you would watch over them, hope they have a productive time and a good learning time, and give them safety. We will miss him this morning. Appreciate the ministry that he has here. For committees as they meet in preparation for our annual business meeting, that everything would be done decently and in order, that we would see our church grow this year, that we would have souls come to a saving knowledge of you, we would have hearts tender to your word, and we would have folks that are willing to spread your word wherever they be. Pray for Camp Evangel, and I trust that they will have another productive summer. It's been great to see how you have been blessing and increasing the last couple of years. It doesn't happen by accident. It happens by a lot of hard work. It happens by dedicated staff. It happens because you have blessed with replacing go-karts and fixing up buildings and helping to make the camp more energy efficient and a safer place to be. And I trust as some of the grant money still comes in for things like pool, there are some big things trying to accomplish at Camp Evangel, and I trust that not only will the money come in for those projects, but the manpower to help replace all of the things and fix up the things that need to be done. Pray for Brian and Tab. I know he's probably quite busy with the loss of the pastor at their church. And I know pretty soon he's going to be traveling, if he hasn't already started traveling, trying to find summer staff and promote the camp. And I pray that you would watch over them and give them safety as they travel. That your word would go forth with power. And we would continue to be able to reach young people in our area through camping ministry. Pray for the kids that come to Awana. Sometimes we have really large groups, and sometimes we have lesser groups. Help us to be faithful in preparing our lessons, to be diligent in asking kids about their eternal security and understanding for sure what salvation really means. Help us to make a difference in their lives. So many of them don't have very good home lives. So help them through us to see a loving Savior. And today, as we look into your word, help us to see the need the way we see the need. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. We're going to be in John chapter 5 this morning. I struggled just a little bit because I kind of wanted to go through the whole chapter at first. The first half is about a situation that happens as Jesus is approaching the feast at Jerusalem. And then the second half is the way that the whole entire second half of this chapter is a solid red letter edition, if you have that type of a Bible, because it is Jesus' response to what folks have said about how he treated this man and what he's trying to do and the accusations against him. But I decided, for sake of time, that we would limit ourselves to the first 16 chapters. So I want to look at the situation this morning and learn some things about the character of Christ that may seem a little different to you, but we ought to emulate. We'll start in verse 1. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is at Jerusalem by the sheep market a pool, which is called in the Hebrew tongue Bethesda, having 5 porches. In these lay a great multitude of impotent folk, both blind, halt, withered, waiting for the moving of the water. For an angel went down at a certain season into the pool and troubled the water. Whosoever then first, after the troubling of the water, stepped in was made whole of whatsoever disease he had. And a certain man was there which had an infirmity 38 years. Excuse me. When Jesus saw him lie, and knew that he had been a long time in that case, he saith unto them, Wilt thou be made whole? The impotent man answered him, Sir, I have no man when the water is troubled to put me into the pool. But while I am coming, another steppeth down before me. Jesus saith unto him, Rise, take up thy bed, and walk. And immediately the man was made whole, and took up his bed, and walked. And on the same day was the Sabbath. The Jews therefore said unto him that was cured, It is the Sabbath day. It is not lawful for thee to carry thy bed. He answered them, He that made me whole, the same said unto me, Take up thy bed, and walk. Then asked they them, What man is that which said unto thee, Take up thy bed, and walk? And he that was healed wist not who it was, for Jesus had conveyed himself away, a multitude being in that place. Afterward Jesus findeth him in the temple, and saith unto him, Behold, thou art made whole, sin no more, lest a worse thing come unto thee. The man departed and told the Jews that it was Jesus which had made him whole. Therefore did the Jews persecute Jesus, and sought to slay him, because he had done these things on the Sabbath day. Not sure what feast is being talked about here. A lot of folks think this was the Passover. Not so sure about that, because if you go back to chapter 3, he's celebrating the Passover. I don't think a whole year has passed between John chapter 3 and John chapter 5. But there are 3 feasts that require that all males attend. All of the other feasts were optional. So it could have been Feast of Tabernacles or one of the others. In chapter 4, we learn that he left Galilee when he was observing the Passover. He left Judea, and he is headed up to Galilee. Now, Judea is way down here in the south, and Galilee is up by the north, and it's a substantial journey, covers much of Israel. If you were to walk it or derive it in this day, you would see what a lengthy journey he is undertaking. And in chapter 4, what's interesting is, as he is headed back up to Galilee, instead of crossing over the Jordan and going up the right side, and then crossing back over into Galilee like most good Jews do, in chapter 4 we have a situation with a woman at the well, and it says he must needs go through Samaria. And so he actually took the road that goes through the mountains along the left side and stopped at Samaria. One of the things that you need to know, when it says in verse 1, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem, a lot of times we are oriented towards the compass. So when we say, I went up to Pennsylvania, we say that because it's north of us. That is not the way the Jewish people spoke. They spoke in terms of altitude. And because Jerusalem is a city that is up high, anything that was lower than that, you went up to Jerusalem, okay? And so if you were headed from Jericho to Jerusalem, you would go up. And if you were headed from Galilee to Jerusalem, even though those are opposite directions, you're still going up to Jerusalem, because they are referring to the fact that Jerusalem is higher. It's talking about the healing pool of Bethesda here near, this says the sheep market. It's near the sheep gate. The gate was a particular gate in the side there, and it wasn't far from this 5 porches they talk about. There's actually several pools that are in that area. I looked at one of the maps. And the porches were arranged around these 3 different pools fed by a spring. I read a lot of hoopla about it's supposed to have healing powers and all this nonsense. No, there weren't any healing powers in the water, or the people wouldn't have been waiting for them to be stirred. And if it was the fact that there were minerals or something in the water and you had to stir up the water to activate the minerals, then it wouldn't be just the first person who got in there who was healed. We're not talking about some scientific healing springs, warm springs or hot springs over in the other county over there, but we're talking about an angel came down, stirred the water. The first person that steps in is the one that gets healed. And so a lot of people have researched this and tried to figure out when this happened. Some of the Bible scholars think that this happened when Jerusalem had their major feasts. So when they had their major feasts, the halt and the lean would gather at these porches, hoping to be the first one to step into the water when the water was stirred. It's interesting because the Bible doesn't really talk to us a whole lot about how many people were healed It doesn't give us a description of how the angel did it or whether the angel was visible when this happened. It's one of those things in Scripture that we read a couple of occurrences about, but there's actually very, very little information about it. All we know is, doesn't matter what the disease was, the first person that stepped down into the water after the angel stirred it was healed. What's interesting here, Jesus has been down to Jerusalem for a very busy holiday. And then he travels all the way up through Galilee, stopping at Samaria first to deal with the Samaritan woman. He's in Galilee for a little while, and you have another feast that comes up. So now he travels from Galilee all the way back down to Jerusalem. And all of that is simply stated in the first verse. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. We actually don't even know if this was a required feast or not. If this isn't a required feast, it's quite a lot of travel to come from Galilee all the way down to Jerusalem for what would have been a lesser feast and wouldn't have been something that was required by the law. But it does set up something that's very important. Because you have this multitude of people that are gathered by this pool, and they're all waiting for this significant event that we're not even sure how often it happened. When the angel comes down, all we know is it's a certain season, and they all knew when it was because they're all gathered around waiting for it. Angel's going to trouble the water, and they're all hoping to get in there. And we're told there was a certain man there which had an infirmity 38 years. Now, a lot of questions always run through my mind when I'm thinking about these different things. Why didn't Jesus just go in and heal them all? I mean, you got this whole multitude of people gathered around on the porches, and this guy obviously has been waiting 38 years for a cure. It's a long time to deal with a physical infirmity. Why doesn't Jesus go in and just like shotgun him? Be healed, 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 be healed. You know? Or he could have just walked in and said, hey, y'all, get up and go home. You're better. And the whole group of them would have been healed. I believe he does what he does for a couple of reasons. He is teaching us some important things here. Verses 1 through 5, he teaches us that he sought out a man that needed help. Now we know that as he walked about, there are multitudes that gathered around him. And we know that there are a lot of folks who brought sick and maimed unto him. There was even an occurrence where he was walking along the street, and there's a lady who has some problems, and she reaches out and grabs the bottom of his skirt as he goes by, and it was enough to heal her. And the disciples were kind of shocked when Jesus stops and says, who touched me? Because obviously there was a huge multitude of people banging and thronging around him. So the fact that he knew that somebody touched him was a little shocking to the disciples with the amount of people that were gathered around. He would have walked by that lady, and had she not reached out and touched him, she still would not have been healed. You say, well, that doesn't sound like a good God to me. Nonetheless, he did not wait for this man to come to him. This guy for 38 years has been going to this pool and laying beside this pool, waiting for the angel to stir the water, and he's obviously in such bad situation that as he's trying to crawl his way into the pool, somebody else runs by him and gets in there first. Can you imagine the physical toll, the psychological toll, the mental toll that this infirmity has taken on him? To watch somebody else year after year, maybe 2 or 3 or 4 times a year, we don't know, try to crawl that pool and be the first person in when the water's stirred, and always have somebody else beat you to it. There's no special relationship that this guy has with Jesus Christ. It's kind of obvious that they do not know each other. If you look in verse 7, the impotent man answered him, Sir. He doesn't say Jesus. He doesn't address him by anything. He simply just uses a common term of respect that you would for any stranger that addresses you. If you go down to verse 11, it says, He answered them, He that made me whole. Doesn't use his name, isn't really even able to describe him. And then you go back down to verse 13, and it says, He that was healed wist not who it was, for Jesus had conveyed himself away. And so when they press him, he's looking through the multitude, and Jesus isn't standing there. If there's a sketch artist available, he's not giving them a good sketch. There isn't really a relationship that develops. Jesus simply realizes, like he did with the Samaritan woman, there is somebody in need, and I am going to inconvenience myself, and I'm going to go find that person, and I'm going to meet the need. Sometimes you hear about things like friendship evangelism. Now, please don't misunderstand me. I believe that it's important that we develop relationships with folks, and that we may use those relationships to try to lead them to Jesus Christ. But if that's the only way you're evangelizing, there's a problem. Because there are people in need that you're not going to have the time to make your close friend before they understand what you're talking about. Sharing the gospel is something that happens to more folks than just come here. Our responsibility is not just to share the gospel in Sunday school and in Sunday morning and in Sunday night. Our responsibility is to find the people that need help and to help them. We see that because he went where they were. He did not go down to the feast and gather around at the temple and wait for the sick to be carried to him at the temple. He didn't wander the streets of Jerusalem because that's not where they were. There's no help for them wandering around in the streets of Jerusalem. Oh, somebody may have chucked them a denarii or a shekel or something like that would have temporarily helped out with their life. But the real life-changing thing was happening in the 5 porches near the pools, hoping that they were the first one to step in when the angel stirred the water. So that's where he went. This man has nothing to offer him. In fact, if you want to do an interesting study sometime, go through and look at all the miracles that Jesus Christ performed, and then look at how many times the folks even actually thanked him. It's kind of shocking to me that he does miracle after miracle after miracle, and in the case of the feeding of the 5,000, and then just a little time later, the feeding of the 4,000, it's almost as if they expect it, and it's almost as if it's due to them, and they don't even seem real appreciative of it. In fact, the very first time he says to them, if you want to be my disciple, it's going to cost you something. Thousands of them pack up and leave and go home. So he works on behalf of this man, even though this guy has nothing to offer him. In verse 6 and 7, we see a second important principle. He determined who wanted help. Who wanted help. When Jesus saw him lie and knew that he had been a long time in the case, he said unto him, Will thou be made whole? You say, that's a stupid question. The guy's laying there on the porch next to the pool, and he's trying to crawl in and be the first one to get in there, and you walk up and actually ask the guy if he wants to be made whole? Listen, you've probably known some folks who are in some dire circumstances that really don't want to be helped. They want to complain about it, they want to talk about it, but they really don't want help. They don't want real help. And so Jesus asked him a question. Will you be made whole? And the man answers and says, I have an excuse. So what's really interesting to me is you cannot help someone that doesn't want it. He doesn't just walk up to this man, and even though he knows his condition, poof him and make him whole. He first has a conversation with him and asks him, do you want to be whole? I would imagine this multitude of folks that were gathered around the porch, some of them were fully capable of stepping down into the pool themselves. And when you try to help someone, whether it's a physical situation or whether it's a spiritual situation, you're going to encounter a lot of folks that are just okay and they'll do it themselves. They don't need any help from you. And some folks have someone else to help them. They have a family member or they have a neighbor and they're maybe leaning on them and they're waiting for the water to be stirred and their family member or their friend or whatever is going to help them. And in that case, they don't want any help from you either. And then there are some people, even though they may be laying there on the porch where healing is about to happen, they're so discouraged and they're so frustrated and life has beat them down so much that they'd rather just be left alone because they would rather not get carried right to the edge of the pool to have somebody else step down in front of them one more time. And so sometimes when you're trying to help someone, you're dealing with a lot of baggage that has just beat them up. But notice that everyone has an excuse, but Jesus isn't sidetracked by it. In fact, it's kind of interesting because he actually challenges him about the very excuse that he gave him. And isn't that interesting? Because that's what he did with the woman at the well. He's trying to make the woman at the well aware of her spiritual need, and she tries to use where we worship and how we worship as a way to not talk about the real need. And Jesus just brings it right back around and says, you've got to worship in spirit and in truth. See what he says to this guy? Jesus says unto him, rise, take up thy bed and walk. He asked him to do the very thing that he could not do. Try again. Try again. Verse 8. He is willing to help. Now, one thing that screams at me when I read this situation is this man was obviously not concerned about spiritual things. He is only concerned about his physical needs. For 38 years, he has been beat up by life. He is worn out. He is beat down. He is having a really, really tough time. And he is not concerned about spiritual things. There are times that folks ask our church for help. And there are times that, you go to help them and they want to talk about spiritual things and they promise that they're going to start coming to your church and they're going to do all these different things. And I try to determine where they are spiritually and share the gospel with them, because some folks know some Bible verses to quote to you, make it sound good like they're trying or whatever. But the truth of the matter is, most of them never guarded these doors. So the question then becomes, do you help the person or not? Do you help the person simply because it is in your power to do so? Or do you help the person for the ulterior motive that you expect them to come to church if I'm going to help you? This man is obviously not concerned about spiritual things. And even if he does start going to the temple, humanly speaking, what does Jesus gain by it? You look at it and you say, well, Jesus has his own excuses. After all, he was busy. He's just traveled a long way. He's come all the way from Galilee down to Jerusalem. There is a feast happening. There's a lot going on in Jerusalem at this time period. A lot better ways to be able to spend his time than to go down here to the pool. And it's the Sabbath day. So, by all accounts, if we're looking at it, where should Jesus be? Yeah, the temple. And every time he comes down to Jerusalem, whether it's a feast or something else, everybody keeps getting all upset with it. So if you're coming down to the feast day, why don't you just sneak in and sneak out and cause the least amount of ripples possible to make life easier for yourself? But that's not what Jesus does. Because he isn't concerned about the Sabbath day, and he isn't concerned about the ripples, and he isn't concerned about how tired he is from traveling, and he's not concerned about missing something that's going on at the feast day. What he is concerned about is this man needs help, and I can help him, so he's going to help him. He's willing to help him. Look at verses 12 and 13. Notoriety was not important. Boy, I can't tell you how many times folks want to get a lot of attention, or they want to be recognized for all kinds of things. I'm shocked nowadays at how many times folks claim to have done something and they didn't. People wearing uniforms around as if they served and sacrificed and were shot at, and they were never even in the military. It's called false honor, and it's a crime. Political folks who claim credit for this and this and this and this, and they really had nothing at all to do with it. Jesus is not concerned about the notoriety. He doesn't care. Some people saw what happened. How do you know? Because it says a large multitude was gathered on that porch. Now, I'm going to tell you that if you walk into a large multitude of people and they're gathered down in an area and they're all waiting for, their attention is going to be on that pool, and all of a sudden this guy over here that's been waiting for 38 years to get in that pool first, all of a sudden jumps up, starts carrying his bed off. Tell me that folks didn't notice. You know what I don't see here? I don't see the TV evangelist Jesus show up. He doesn't walk down here where a large multitude of people is, raise his hands and say, "Hey, can I have everybody's attention? I feel the Holy Spirit in this place." He does not make a big deal out of himself. He doesn't ask for anything. If any of you have 25 denarii, let me have your seed money, and I promise you that in the future God's going to bring it back to you, and your life is going to be manifold by. No. It's not about his benefit. It's not about attention to himself. Now, he's going to draw attention, and he's going to have a long conversation with the Pharisees and Sadducees in the second half of the chapter. But he walks in, changes this man's life forever, and he doesn't even tell him his name. We already looked at 3 passages, and the guy has no idea who he is. You don't know. Doesn't have a clue. I'll tell you something else he didn't do. He didn't walk into this group and belittle anyone. "Oh, well, you have such and such, but you're not worthy of this greatness." He didn't make this man feel like he was incompetent. He didn't put him down in any way. He simply said, "I know life has been rough on you, but what I really want to know is, do you want help, or are you satisfied in your misery?" Can I suggest to you folks that when we go and share the gospel with somebody, that's really the only thing that we can do too? Do you really want the answer to life's most basic question? Or are you just satisfied in your misery? And he quietly slips off. See, what's interesting is in verse 13 it says, "For Jesus had conveyed himself away." In other words, he just stepped behind this person and then behind that person and then disappeared. He didn't start running through the crowd making a big deal. The man picked up his bed and he started to walk off. And while everybody's looking at that man, Jesus just disappeared. It was about the act. It wasn't about the recognition. Verse 14, he is not satisfied with just acts of charity. Afterward, Jesus findeth him in the temple and said unto him, "Behold, thou art made whole. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come unto thee." Now, usually when you were healed of something like this, it would have meant that you had been impure and you were not allowed to worship in the temple. The Jews are all about being able to worship in the temple. So one of the very first things you would do as soon as you were clean is you would go and show yourself to the priest, and they would begin the ritualistic cleansing that would allow you to participate with all the other folks in temple worship. And so he's up there at the temple. Jesus is headed up to the temple. Different way, different time. They don't meet each other on the way. This guy goes to meet the priest and start the cleansing ritual so he can participate in the things of the temple. Jesus sees him at the temple, and there are some important things that we find out here. This is the second time that Jesus initiates and finds him. The man didn't find Jesus. He was at the porch, and Jesus went to the porch. The guy doesn't go to the temple and look for Jesus Christ. He doesn't even know who he is. Jesus Christ comes and finds him at the temple. different place, a different time, and a different situation. Sometimes we want to force Jesus Christ on folks and they're not ready for it. Jesus didn't ask him after he stood up with his bed and say, "Now, buddy, let me tell you, you're fixing to go to hell unless you fix your ways. You better straighten up." Because the man wasn't paying attention to that. Everything about his rotten life has him beat down, so Jesus deals with the physical need, and then he walks off. And while this man is appreciative, and you got to think, he is walking to the temple. And he is showing himself to the priest. And there are probably people asking about him. And he's excited and he is appreciative. His life has changed already. But not enough for Jesus Christ. Because if all he ever does is heal him from this physical disease, he's going to spend eternity in hell. And that's not okay. So now it's a different place. And now it's a different time. And now it's a different situation. Now it's a different focus. And Jesus is going to address his spiritual need. It's not enough just to fix the physical needs around us, folks. We have to address the spiritual needs. But I want you to see what he does. He changed the focus from an all-consuming, lifelong challenge. And then he asked him, "Are you ready for just as drastic a spiritual change?" And the man is probably sitting there thinking, "Wow, my life is completely changed because I'm healed." And Jesus says your spiritual life could change just as drastically if you have forgiveness for your sin. He uses the physical as an object lesson for the spiritual. But notice, he doesn't force him. He says, "Behold, thou art made whole." Physical. "Sin no more, lest a worse thing come unto thee." Look at verse 15. The man fell on his knees and said, "Lord, Lord," and worshipped him. No. Fell on his knees and said, "You're the one. Thank you so much." Nope. It says, like Nicodemus, "How can I have this?" Nope. It says the man what? Departed. And Jesus gathered up his skirts and ran down the street saying, "Buddy, do you understand what I'm telling you? You're going to die and go to hell if you don't." No. Fixing the physical wasn't enough. He addressed the spiritual, but it's not up to us, folks, when we address the spiritual need with someone to beat them over the head and force them to get down on their knees and pray a prayer. They will come to Jesus and be healed the same way this guy was physically when they see their need and step out in faith and obedience. Listen carefully. That man is laying there, and for 38 years he's been a wretch. And he is pretty sure that this time when the angel stirs the water, no matter how fast he crawls or whatever he tries to do, it's very probable that someone else is stepping down before him. So Jesus walks in and says, "You want to be made whole? Yes, I do. But I have a great excuse for not being whole. You want to be whole? You pick up your bed and walk." Listen to me. If that man lays there, he dies in his physical condition. Right? If he lays on that bed, for how many more years does he suffer in that physical condition, even though Jesus Christ could have drastically changed his life? And when we get to the temple, Jesus treats him in the exact same way. You better go and sin no more, or worse things are going to happen to you. He gives him an opportunity, and then it's up to the man to choose. Salvation's like getting on an elevator. You ain't going nowhere, folks, till you push the button. That's all we have to do in salvation. It is a free gift. But if you don't take the gift, you are without the gift still. Last thing, verse 15 and 16. He's not concerned about popularity or approval. Boy, when I read this passage, I want to hunt this guy down and torture him. The man departed and told the Jews that it was Jesus which had made him whole. You say, well, what's the big deal? As far as we know, the man does not respond. No evidence of salvation here. We don't hear about this guy again. It doesn't say that he became one of Jesus' disciples. It doesn't tell us that he was faithful in the temple. We know nothing about this guy after this. Case closed. As far as we know, he walked away from Jesus, healed physically, but as lost can be. But I tell you something that just burns me up. He sold out Jesus. He sold him out. Does it say that the Pharisees and the Sadducees or the Sanhedrin were following him, spying on him? Does it say that any of them were running around the temple trying to figure out who it was? No. So as far as we know, no one knew that he met with Jesus in the temple afterwards. All we know is the man went to the Jews. The Jews didn't come to him. Wow. Let's look at verse 16. And therefore did the Jews persecute Jesus and sought to slay him because he had done these things on the Sabbath day. Because he had done these things on the Sabbath, Jesus broke the law by healing, working on the Sabbath day. So they sought to kill him. But the man they told him, why are you carrying your bed? Because that's work and it's unlawful on the Sabbath day. Are they seeking to kill him? The religious people that you thought would have been excited about somebody getting healed are more concerned about their church rules than they are about somebody's life. And instead of helping Jesus Christ to create great change in their neighborhood, they were resistant to it. And in verses 19 through 47, you'll notice it's all red letter. No amount of evidence will persuade some people. Because Jesus goes on in the second half of the chapter and he says, listen, didn't Isaiah tell you that one would come doing these incredible miracles? And they don't even consider him as the Christ. They don't even look at him as if he might be the Messiah. Does not this, does not this, does not this, does not this, does not this. It's kind of like the trial we got going on. Lay all this stuff out. It doesn't matter. We want to do. Lay all that what we're going to do. Our politics are so messed up today because people have an agenda. They don't care what truth is. Hey folks, there are folks in our community that are so messed up about stuff they really don't care about what the truth of God's Word is. But does that excuse us from finding them where they are and meeting their need, whether it be physical or spiritual, whenever we can and wherever we can? And I got to tell you that sometimes when you do, you're not going to get popularity or approval. You're actually going to get bad mouth, looked down on, and talked about. But does that excuse you from doing what's right in the first place? Him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it is sin. Go ye therefore into all the world and preach the gospel. Not because it's going to make you popular, not because people are going to appreciate it, not because everybody you talk to is going to change. Some people will take your physical help and reject the spiritual help. Jesus didn't unheal him. He let him walk away. because he loved it enough to create him with free will. You have to choose Jesus Christ freely. Let's bow forward. Father, sometimes we get so caught up in the miracles that you perform that we forget that there is a lot of application about your character as well. And I trust that you would help us to see people the way you see people. That you would help us to see needs and to meet needs, whether they be physical or spiritual. Help us to point people to your Son, Jesus Christ. Not to be discouraged when they don't respond. Help us to be faithful anyway. For the fields are white in the harvest, and the times